Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? So today we're going to do a talk, a little bit of a song and a dance about the Milesians, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. Yes, a lot of Annas in there. None of them are named Anna, though. It's weird. All of these guys are from Miletus. So they are known as the Milesians, the Milesian school. They are some of the first Greek philosopher, scientist, cosmologist guys. So if anyone is interested in Greek philosophy or the background of Greek philosophy in cosmology and how people understood the world, the Milesians are really good to get into and get into carefully because they were ancient thinkers who saw the world as full of gods, and then sometimes people have said that they were the first secular thinkers who looked at nature, which of course everybody's been looking at nature and actually saying all things are full of spirits. I've seen people try to turn that very much into, well, that means it's not religious, it's science, and that's interesting, but that's definitely not the ancient world where things were more cosmology than they were religion versus science. So in doing realistic history of thought about the Greeks and everyone else, it is very good to get into the Milesians very simply and directly. And yes, sorry about the traffic noises if you do notice them, but it is hot a bit today. I am a simple country lawyer, and my, it is hot today. So, in the ancient world, cosmology and science and religion were all more so observation. In fact, one of the interesting things that I heard in a history of logic, which I mention often, is that many are impressed with modern science because we actively, like Muslims and Chinese awesome culture did before, is increasingly into technological experimentation. Now, what that means is not only can you use technology in the world and observe the world with farther sailing canoes plenty that are safer, etc., if that's a thing, but you can also then set up experiments such that Islamic folks were doing algebra and setting things up with that. And then at first, Galileo and others didn't have algebra and were setting things up as best they could. And then they had algebra, and setting up experimentation and technology ahead of time is very good for setting up observation. So, in fact, these are folks of the ancient world who more observed the cosmos. And when people say it's the birth of modern science, I have, in a book about Aristotle, I read someone make the wonderful point. Aristotle really observed nature. He didn't actually go out and experiment with nature like modern science. And that's a good point to make, because it is good about, is it Western or not to do science? Well, increasingly what we have is ancient cultures like the Milesians and Aristotle is going to mention these guys. He is one of the major reasons that anything these guys said is preserved at all, because Aristotle gets to rant about philosophy, and he mentions many people whose works are essentially lost. And in those works, he debates ideas of these guys, and for Aristotle, everything, like for Thales, is full of intentional forces. So for Aristotle, everything is kind of intelligent design, and nature is designing itself intelligently and rationally. He is very much an intelligent design guy. So you do see people say, oh, but the Greeks were the first people to secularly look at nature. Well, none of those words make much sense to me, and many people who care would shake their head and say, no, that's the secular is white Protestants getting along, and then also white Catholics and Jews, and then other people much later in the 50s and onward. That's actually very different. But yes, these were guys who should get credit for being cosmologists in a new way beyond what they understood the Persians and the Egyptians to do. And this is because even though everyone is experimenting with life and technology in nature, and so are the Hawaiians and others, because that's what doing activity is in hunter-gathering, etc., etc. Nice Latin. I'm forging the Latin as we speak. That in doing these things and in experimenting with the sciences, we now have modern procedures, and people think of chemistry experiments with a chemistry set, which is a powerful set of tools that you then take pieces of nature and use to process them like a computer. And that is very much modern experimentation and scientific methods. So yes, that would be an awesome reason to think vaccines are probably work a lot, and it'd be hard to make them a total deception. that would be weird, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we gained the brain and learned to think, which is why any particular stage of technology exists as opposed to the earlier stage. So actually, these guys, and I like to make this point very centrally because people have said the Egyptians are perhaps not as rational or scientific as these guys, and have said that about the Persians. I'm not going to name names or get into paragraphs of it. I am somebody who believes in specifically saying that Greco-Roman culture is nice. They themselves would not have thought they were the first scientists, which is a recent word, but scientia in the Roman Latin, and they're not gonna, if I'm forging my Latin again, as one word at a time, mangling it, and they would, yes, have looked at this as new leaps in cosmology, which is what the world was doing. They would not have called it cosmology, which is a fake Greek word. They would more think it was being a physician and a scientist and a priest and looking into the cosmos and how the gods and nature and the spirits and the forces of nature all work. These guys would have seen those forces of nature as very intentional. So the Ionian city-states, like Miletus, were settled around 1000 BCE, and by about 600 BCE, just after Homer and Hesiod, I just got through a lecture about that a little while ago, posted that, around the time of Archilochus and Sappho, who we cover in the same lecture, Miletus became a wealthy center on the Turkish, what is today Turkey. I have been to Ephesus. It's pretty amazing. As far as ancient, well, yes, ancient ruins. It's quite impressive. And around 600 BCE, people like my favorite philosopher, Heraclitus, would be living in Ephesus, nearby on the Turkish coast near Miletus. So they had become, like Phoenicians, whose alphabet goes through the Romans to us, they became wealthy traders, and they were trading and were merchants and mercenaries for powers in the area. And as they were getting going, Archilochus and Sappho and others were doing poetry and art and what was to become the Greek traditional culture celebrated by ancient Greece. All of it, including Sappho. Yes. Miletus was ruled by an aristocracy, powerful families who had the leisure to enjoy education and the arts. They had connections to empires of Egypt and Persia, shown by influences of those empires on their science and art. But they also had the independence to develop a new culture out of what was imported. Many times you can see the balancing of it's supported by a bunch of culture, but it also is sort of on the outskirts. I'm out here in California, and when you're out on the outskirts, you are supported by the money and power, but you kind of can get away with stuff. And ancient Greece, I do think, and also even America, and even Europe rising, even the Arabs before that. You can see many movements of human culture where it is not the oldest, most prominent people who then succeed. A lot of times it is people on the outskirts, just up the river, who are not as prosperous, who take all the stuff, kick it up a notch, and then they become free in doing it a very new way. I think a lot of what people perceive as Greek freedom and also American freedom is very much taking the culture before it and then doing new things with it, which is not actually one golden age as compared to another of cultures. What we would call a golden age of the Aztecs, the Americans, etc., would most likely be taking major pieces of other culture and then developing it. That is very much what the Milesians would have thought they were doing, whether or not we or other people say that entirely. So Thales is the first of the Milesians, of the Milesian school. It's not a formal school, it's a label that applies to these three thinkers. Thales is supposed to have lived sometime between 620 and 550. So he was possibly dying right around the time the Buddha was being born, living around the time of Mahavir, the founder of Jainism, of the Jains in India. He was living before Plato. Plato is coming along about 200 years after that, and Aristotle. So he is more around the time of Sappho and the poets and others. So Diogenes Laertes is a historian who is important, and we're going to mention a couple of times in the lectures about Greece, because he is a Roman Greek source of much biography of the philosophers, and he says a lot of things. He's an early work of Greco-Roman source of talking about the philosophers and their lives, but of course we can't trust much of what he says, and a lot of what he says sounds interesting and right, but we don't know any better, and some of what he says is quite incredible, just like Herodotus and others who seems to think possibly there's dog-headed people near India. There's ways that, or people Cyclops, possibly near India, which, yeah, would maybe, as some have speculated wildly and with some good reason, maybe that's all mixed up with that, because people are seafaring all over the place. But essentially, Diogenes Laertes tells us a bunch of things. He's a biographer of to the philosophers. Yes, a reporter to the stars. And Thales he says Thales was a Phoenician, born to Phoenician noble parents who emigrated to Miletus. And he became famous for his accomplishments. And in an Aristophanes comedy, The Birds, someone declares that the man's a Thales, which is basically, oh yeah, Einstein, kind of thing. So Thales was someone who people thought was a brilliant genius at the time, such that a play can quip that in Athens. Either Thales wrote nothing, or none of his writings survived. Some say he wrote 2 treatises on astronomy, but if he did, they are lost. So he was known for having his head in the clouds. The famous story of Thales that shows that he's an absent-minded professor. I have been known to space out once or twice in my life. My family back in the day lovingly called me a space cadet, and I do love them for it, because it's a nice way of definitely suggesting I was paying attention to something, but not anything outside my mind. There are many stories. I guess everything, of course, according to empiricism, has to be outside at some point, if we are the blankish slate. But, we're tabling our Rosses and etc. So there's many stories of intellectuals spacing out and almost dying while thinking up thoughts that make them famous. And yeah, human thought can make you a legend or possibly get you killed. So Plato and others repeat the story. Thales was gazing at the stars, possibly doing astronomy along with cosmology, and he fell into a well. Gautama, the founder of the logic debate school of Indian thought, of Hinduism, one of the orthodox schools of Hinduism. One of my cats is a clawing at the screen. That he is also said to have fell into a well, and then he was given by Brahma eyes in the feet, which could be symbolic of being a logician and gathering particulars into universals or into groups and concepts mentally. That the same story, oddly, is almost the same story is told of Gautama, who is sort of the Indian Aristotle. And Gautama was living probably more just after Thales was dead. So, yeah, not really sure if there's any of the same thing happened, different things happened. They are stories which, of course, could also suggest, as people mention, that these could be guys gazing into a well in order to look at the reflection of the stars, and they accidentally fell into a well because this at the time was one of the problems of doing cosmology and logic, which for Gautama would mean observing the heavens like Aristotle and trying to come to understandings about how to argue about things, horses, groups of horses, and sheep, and whether they're hooved things or not, and if the cosmos does or doesn't work in these ways. So it could be a refracting device for stars. We are not sure. And again, maybe that was the case for Gautama as well. Either way, Plato says Thales was mocked by a Thracian slave girl. The Greeks had slaves like Thracians who were known for light skin, ginger, red hair, blue eyes. Northern peoples who they specifically slaved are mentioned a lot as slaves. So, yes. Ginger slaves, perhaps, yes, I'm going to make a terrible, you know what I mean. Slaves, do they have full souls? Well, if they're ginger, sure, yes, they do, because gingers and Irish people, have souls. I do like the Onion headline always mention is Irish see strange, large, yellow UFO in the sky. It's like, what is that? I don't know. It's global warming, you know what I mean? It's revealing all kinds of things. So, Thales is mocked by the slave girl, the Thracian redheaded slave girl. Is like, this guy. You know what I mean? One other source says Thales had no family or children of his own, and when asked about it, he said they would be a distraction. It sounds like the Buddha family is a fetter. When Thales nowadays, with grad school, you can't have a family, so that solves that plenty much, While Thales was mocked by some in his time for speculating about the cosmos and then failing to get a family, Aristotle says that Thales hatched a plan, and Aristotle suggests to show people in his Miletus, in his hometown, that people actually could use philosophy and science and that they are useful because they think here's some guy who's never had kids. Wow, he must be useless. So he looks at the stars and he saw there would be a large olive crop. So he rented out and took sort of a temporary monopoly, paid people a couple of coins, got control of all the olive oil presses because he could see in the weather system that it would be a huge benefit. He made a ton of money. And then he just did that, Aristotle says, to show off, because he actually, somewhat in line with Aristotle, claims that Thales was so brilliant because he didn't care about money, he didn't care about family, really, because he was a man dedicated to the cosmos and to the higher things and to scientia. But of course Aristotle wouldn't use Latin, so heck. Aristotle would say craft, like boxing or wrestling or, I guess, staring at the stars or something like that. So another story from various sources says Thales channeled a river for King Cyrus so his soldiers could cross and attack the Persians with far fewer soldiers than he needed. And Cyrus realized his situation and he surrendered to Cyrus, who spared him in Miletus. Cyrus is typically a good guy to the Persians and the Israelites in their sources, and he is a great king, sometimes referred to rather messianically, with the word Messiah meaning some kind of savior more broadly rather than just one and only one in Jewish texts. And so Cyrus, as this model king, Persian, spares him in Miletus. And in fact, the earliest Ephesus and Miletus, these early Greek city-states where the first philosophy, cosmology, science, etc., is coming out fancy from ancient Greek culture. These are people who are spared and then overrun and spared by Persia and Babylon and others, and Egypt. So they know about good and bad kings and who gives you rights or doesn't, and they know a lot and are talking about the cosmos very much in terms as if it is ruled by kings, gods, families, and that there is and isn't stability. This is at a time, again, when people would have seen the world and metaphysics as far less literate text and math as much as they would have seen family, power, politics as structural to everything, essentially. So sources say that he went to Egypt and he learned geometry and astronomy in Egypt and would triangulate pyramids from their shadows, which is basic geometry, which the Egyptians likely had if they were building triangles out in the desert, that he was then going and measuring. Some speak as if he was the first to do this to the pyramids. This does seem like he might have learned all of these techniques, may or might, from the Egyptians and all of that. Thales was said by Diogenes Laertes to have also discovered there are 365 days a year. The Egyptians actually knew this from not the stars, but the Nile, is what experts say. That the Nile, which is not intuitive, you would think that the regularity of the stars would teach you 365 days a year. There then is 365 and a quarter days a year, the Egyptians knew, and they actually gave a demigod. I like to joke they gave a half god to a quarter day. They gave a demigod to each of the quarter day of the year. So there's a god for that. That they knew this from the Nile, in fact, which I don't understand how they would know a quarter of a day, what have you. They must have gotten that also from the stars, but they definitely figured out something like 365 days a year from the Nile, is what some say. And I would consult them on that, but that is quite incredible. So, once again, Thales may have not have discovered any of these things. He went to Egypt, in a place where people were doing these things. He discovered them there. It is also said Thales was one of the first to claim the soul is immortal and that it is reincarnated. What we also find is that whether or not the Greeks believed in reincarnation before, oftentimes early on societies believe in reincarnation and come up with systems of that. Whether or not then the pharaoh and others get to join the pharaoh or the Buddha in the Pure Lands in the afterlife. That is a pattern we won't talk about so much right here. Thales is said to have been to Babylon as well, and he looked over their astronomical records, and it allowed him supposedly to predict an eclipse. There's the passing eclipse outside. In 585 BCE. And did he travel to these places? And as far as I understand, his methods of predicting eclipses would have been somewhat in accord with Babylonian methods, but also, I do believe at the current time that, and I've said it to classes before, at the moment, no experts know how Thales actually predicted that eclipse, which means possibly not that he simply predicted it and knew what he was doing, but he may have predicted an eclipse, was accidentally right, and he and the Babylonians are sometimes accidentally right about these things. But I actually have to say this isn't my area, and that is my understanding, is that I don't believe experts know how Thales or the Babylonian priests predicted eclipses at that time. So take that for what you will. So yes, Thales believed that all elements are alive. All things are full of gods or spirits. He saw the static charge from Polish... He saw it from Polish amber. I am reading my notes. From polished amber, and when you rub amber and it has a charge... And he saw that in lodestones and magnets as proof that spirits are inside of everything and that everything moves due to living forces. Thales argued there was no difference between being alive and being dead, and when asked by a skeptical critic why then Thales should not just die, Thales said, because there's no difference. Which is a good reply to that. Well, why not just die? It's the same, really. Like Plato and Aristotle, Thales had a teleological view of the cosmos. What teleology means, which is a good word, is purpose. Telos is purpose, and in the Greek, in the roots. And so if you have a teleology, you would have a study of purpose. If you believe in intelligent design, you would believe that bananas have a purpose, that the gods or God designed bananas with some sort of thing in mind where they gave bananas to the people, or they formed the orders of nature, and those orders of nature then in accord did what they were supposed to do. Again, whether or not you believe in intelligent design, and whether or not you are a theist, or many are not polytheists in my class, but I assume some are, that Thales supposedly was a teleological guy of the ancient world and saying all things are full of gods. And I do like to tell a story that there was a Roman Stoic who, when I was in grad school getting my master's degree in essentially Greek and Indian and Chinese thought in the vehicles of religion and doing religious studies and history as history of philosophy, which is what I got my master's degree in, so I know things about Indian, Greek, Chinese philosophy and how they're used in history. That teleology is a very interesting subject, and there was a Roman Stoic, a minor figure I believe, who wrote in a travel journal observation that he went down into a cave like Carlsbad Caverns, but not near San Diego, and he saw beautiful stalactites and stalagmites, and he thought, this is horrifying. And why would he think this was horrifying? Well, because for an ancient teleological cosmologist, if there is something beautiful, then it should be there to be seen. That there should be something seeing the beauty. Why would there be beauty in the world if it's not being seen by eyes? That is more the ancient teleological view you find often. It isn't even that everybody had to have that view, but in thinking the world is theological or has theory in it, and that gravity is doing things, which is a more recent mechanic, you then would have people also thinking, well, there would be beauty thus physically expressed in certain ways such that it would make sense mathematically. Very much like some think the golden ratio is part of the metaphysics of the universe or what have you, and then others say, no, it really isn't. That's more pleasing to the human head. This would be that there should not be beauty unless it is intended by nature. So you can see here somewhat anthropomorphism. It is human beings expecting the world to be not just mathematical, but beautiful for creatures like us. And why would it be beautiful for nothing but bats who can't see? That doesn't make any danged sense. Hopefully, well, if he had seen the bats, perhaps he would think they could see. I don't know. But for an ancient, for someone like Aristotle or Thales, it's good to mention that they would not have necessarily understood you if you said that things just didn't make sense and were just there. For them, they believe in a rational cosmos. That means I don't so much. I don't know. I am agnostic about how rational the cosmos is, but it has struck me for a very long time, whether or not one is a theist or atheist or agnostic or what have you, that the world would not have to be either mathematical, nor would it have to be pretty for us. Heraclitus, my favorite Greek philosopher, says this early on, says we're apes and to the gods, and of course we find apes beautiful. And apes find apes beautiful. Do you find apes beautiful? No, you don't. So why Heraclitus and Stoics love Heraclitus, oddly enough, would the caverns have to be beautiful for humans? Well, again, somebody who knows Heraclitus might think, but if the gods are working the cosmos, they wouldn't create this beauty and not let human beings see it and bury it so far underground. I don't get that at all. Because that would be more the way of standing the world understanding and standing. The world is mathematical and has ratios in it and is rational. They would just think beauty existed for beautiful stuff. Like they wouldn't get why it would just randomly exist. That would be lol so random. They would not understand. That would be horrifying. So yes, that's always good to mention. For Thales, water is the primary element. It's similar to Anaximenes saying air is. Anaximenes says air is the primary arche. Heraclitus says fire is. All of these are fluid elements, unlike the earth. Water is the principle of all things for Thales, which is very similar to Heraclitus saying all things flow and change like a river, while maintaining that this is basically all fire. Things are born out of chaos and flux, just as in Hesiod's Theogony, stabilizing to become what they are, and then destabilizing and falling back into the general flow. There's a dispute whether or not Thales says all things come from water but become something different, or whether or not he actually means things remain water and remain water in character even when they turn into stone and earth. You could see it either way. Effectively, if everything is of water, it remains water in essence or potential in some sort of way, if it then goes back to primary element or elements. So why would Thales claim water transforms into various elements? Well, Miletus, as many have said, is on the mouth of the meander, like rivers meander, and that deposits silt and sediment that built up on the banks, and so it looks like every year water turns into earth. So to an observer, not somebody setting up experimentation, notice if you had experimentation more so, you might set up water and shake it and see, no, it doesn't turn into earth. These guys were more observing nature and saying, look, you can see the earth building up out of the water. Thales argues land even floats on water, thus actually all the continents are tectonically drifting on water, which is the primary central underlying element of the periodic table-ishness of this, and then you would have Earth floating on top of it, and he did argue this is why earthquakes are real, and if you throw a handful of earth into the river, much of it will float on the river. So he would have thought, via simple experimentation, hand-throwings of dirt, and also looking at things at the time, this was the fanciest, most amazing thinking that people had. Keep in mind, many people have credited this with the birth of modern science, and would have thought this is the first time somebody thinks, well, what it probably is more so for me is people were doing things in Egypt and Persia, and here is somebody actually thinking for a new time ever some cool stuff like, hey, I think the relationship between water and dirt is different from what other people have said, and they've also been talking about water and earth and basic elements of the 5 or the 4 as far as how this stuff works. So he did believe that earthquakes were caused by tectonic drift on water. It does seem that Earth drifts on water. Thales saw that water breaks things into their components, which he saw as evidence that water is the primordial element. So water's basic ability to clean and separate gives water a dual role as a destroyer, yet also a purifier. Egyptian priests use water, very much like Catholic priests in Catholicism, to bless things and purify things, but water, like fire, is is a very cleansing but primordially dangerous element. You can drown in water, you can burn in fire, but you also need fire to see at night. So water and fire are very primordial elements for ancient people that are very useful, very powerful, but also, of course, thus deadly. Persian Zoroastrians focused on fire as purifying and kept a flame burning during daily reenactments of the cosmos. It is a wonderful thing to know with ancient cosmology that Catholic priests all have to do, like Zoroastrian priests, very much like Persians, they actually do the Mass every day because in certain ways they're actually helping the cosmos to circle the seasons around. That the cosmos are these great workings of the elements. And so when the priests or priest and the gods or god, when they're doing the rituals, when the tribe is doing the dance, they're helping to turn the seasons around. When you see like an Aboriginal tribe doing a dance in a circle and they're singing about the cosmos, they believe they are not only participating in it, they, like having children, are helping the world to spin. So, in a certain sense, blessing things with water and fire and keeping a fire burning for Hanukkah and for the Zoroastrian Persians and others and monotheists and others before that, they believed that they were keeping the fire and the water going in certain ways by interacting with them chemically and physically through the ritual process, like having science classes enough to know chemistry, like something kind of like that. It's just we would put 3 people through the circles of chemistry rather than necessarily make them do a Catholic ritual over and over to understand more so and be grounded in what so based fire is. But yeah, basically Thales believed things are very based in water and thought that was very physically true. And so people look at him and think this is one of the Greeks who helped invent periodic understandings of elements. So yes, that is Thales. My computer, again, is strangely overheatedly hissing, so we're going to call it a day. I'm not going to immerse it in water, see if it emerges again, like some sort of primordial god being. So instead of that, I will sign out now, and I'm going to get to the Anaximander and the Anaximenes and mythical snow people to the north in a bit. So much happiness, and hope you are all good.